Broken to Brave, episode 15, number 17, Didn't Get Sucked In. I was raised in a Catholic home and went to a Catholic school for 8 years. I was steeped in guilt. I was also taught to believe that any conflict was my fault. By that I mean that if someone was upset with me for any reason, for instance, if I said no to someone and they got upset, it was my fault. I should keep the peace at all cost, whether or not the other person is wrong. Because of that, I got a warped view of relationships. I've got Catholic guilt, an unrealistic sense that I can't have any conflict in a relationship, and then there's obligation. We were obligated to go to events, participate, whatever, whether we wanted to or not. Whether it was convenient, healthy, something we wanted to do or not, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether or not I was expected to be there. Have plans with friends? Why would you do that? We have a family party for the 12th time this year. Not going causes guilt, conflict, and a barrage of, but you have to be there conversations. It was just easier to go until it wasn't. Eventually, it was far more damaging to go, and the weeks of recovery from an event was no longer worth it. So I said no. Over and over, and I hated it every time, and I wanted to throw up, and I wanted to cry, and I wanted to run back and say, okay, I'll go. But I knew I couldn't go back. I sat in the guilt and the fear of conflict and the overwhelming sense of obligation, and I stayed out of it all, except sometimes I forgot and would emotionally get sucked back in. But not this day. This day, I recognized it and reminded myself of the truth. This day, I remembered that I don't have to carry the guilt. I remembered that conflict is healthy and that it's not my responsibility to make peace with people who are unkind or unhealthy. I remembered that my only real obligation is to my husband and my daughter. They come first and not anyone else. That I have an obligation to my health and well-being, and that as soon as something threatens those things, I am no longer obligated to participate. The guilt subsided, the fear of saying no subsided, and my sense of obligation switched over to the rightful place, my daughter, my husband, and myself. I released myself from anything else placed on me that day and didn't get sucked in. That was a big, brave, scary day. Sometimes bravery is saying no. Episodes of Broken to Brave are released every Tuesday and Thursday. Thank you so much for listening and for joining me on this journey of healing and growth. If you want to go deeper into this story and hear it from a spouse's perspective, my husband and I have a Patreon-only show where we have an extended, behind-the-scenes discussion of every episode, which also posts twice a week. Here's a sample of our latest Patreon-only companion podcast. So for me to leave and expose myself further to that level of what is the word? Engineering, or narrative that's going to come out of me saying no to these things.
Well, it's also gaslighting to an extreme.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, going back to the premise of the show, that was brave as hell to plant your flag and say, nope, we're not going.
And I will take whatever you're going to dish out to me, and however abusive and mean and whatever else, and whatever you guys decide to talk about behind my back, and spread all over, because you know what? It all came back because they're freaking children would come and tell me. And it's like, I don't want to know what they're saying, but we've known because people told us. Yeah. And whether it was their kids or a family friend or a cousin or somebody always told us, you know what they're saying? Yeah, we're well aware. And they go, why do they think that? That's not who you are. I'm like, I know, but whatever. It can't change their mind. So I stayed away.
Yeah.
I endured the barrage of attacks trying to get me to change my mind.
Yep.
And I didn't get sucked back in.
Well done.
We're much better off now, aren't we?
Much, much better off.
And we have so many, like when we look around now, And we are so lucky, and our lives are filled with so many loving people, and it's just a joy. And it's I wish people will have asked me, you know, what would you have told your younger self, or what would you have done differently? And every time I say, I would have told my 19-year-old self, go to New York when Rob asks you to. And I changed. I mean, I always say I wouldn't, because then we wouldn't have Molly. That would have changed the trajectory of our lives, and we wouldn't be here today. So I wouldn't. But that is what I wish that I had spared you. I wish that I had spared her. And I really...
Let's just go with it made life more interesting. It's all good.
Gave us a lot of stories. My therapist doesn't think they're funny. I always say, oh, here's a funny one. And then she's like, that's not funny.
That's how this podcast was going to start, actually.
Yeah.
We were discussing briefly what we could talk about on this one. And, you know, like kind of the perspective.
It didn't go the direction we were.
And you said, oh, I've got some funny stories. And I went, those are not funny.
Yeah.
They're not funny stories.
Yeah.
We are amused by them.
Because what's the alternative?
Right.
Right?
But they are not
because it hurts.
Funny.
It hurts. And it sucks.
Yeah.
And it's so unnecessary.
To hear the rest of this episode and get other exclusives, become a patron to Broken to Brave at patreon.com. You can also follow my blog at brokentobrave.com for even more insights and engaging content. Links are in the show notes. Broken to Brave is a production of Southgate Media Group, hosted and written by me, Martha Southgate. Thank you so much for listening. Now go do something brave.